Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Munro Live. Jordan Arocha here, I'm with Kevin Hardy, and today we're going to review the Bolt again. Sandy had done a Hoist review of it, and he said that there wasn't a lot to see. We agree with him, so we're just going to review 50 or so things that Kevin and I saw, having walked under the vehicle with the front aero shield off, which in Sandy's defense, without the aero shield off, there's a lot of the content that we'll talk about is, sort of focused in this area. So, Kevin, maybe to get us started, what are a few things that you picked up on when you looked under here?
Sure. Well, the first thing I want to talk about is one thing you can't see. So, unfortunately, with the aero shields on, we still have the wheel liners. I feel like required to talk about safety. But this vehicle does, at least the previous iteration that we had torn down in 2017, have an interesting kind of trifecta of crush cans for SORB, or small overlap crush testing. So it has the main engine bay rail, there is a crush can here, and then they have a supplementary set of crush cans off to the side that come outward and help engage the barrier. So that's a very offensive strategy, as we kind of talked to, versus defensive, where you have most of your reinforcement closer to the occupant cabin space. So there is some weight and complexity up here, but it's an interesting strategy. We've never seen anything like that. But now as we kind of move down, you can see here, much like the Mach-E, we have essentially steel outriggers from the Cradle moving forward. You have a relatively cheap and ductile material for frontal impact. And then as it moves rearward to the Cradle itself, we go into a pretty optimized casting here. You can see there's a fair amount of material in the four parts of it here, and then it gets skeletonized as it moves rearward with scallops cut into it, and then there's an angled profile here, and more than likely for the powertrain in the event of some frontal impact to kind of get up and over potentially, at least to try and control its movement in a manner that GM wants the powertrain to kind of function in some of these impact events. And in a similar fashion, if you want to come around with the camera here, we have two water pumps hanging off the backside of the FEM as well. The Mach-E had a similar execution, and then they kind of add water pumps based off of the trim level and performance level of the vehicle itself.
Yeah, I guess continuing with the impact script, right, as Kevin had mentioned, so these steel beams engage relatively early in a frontal impact event. The leading edge of this cast cradle is ramped upward, and then the trailing edge of the cradle has these little brackets or these stoppers just rearward of it. So in between the cradle or the subframe and the battery pack, they're putting these little brackets. To me, when I look at these specifically, not so much the ramp that I was just mentioning in the front of the cradle, but these, it makes me think this is a late add. This is not intended to be in the vehicle from day one. This is perhaps during the first physical testing that they may have done on a prototype, right? So preliminary tooling is cut for the vehicle. They're going to build up a few prototypes, run some impact scenarios. They probably observed at some point in time that this cradle, if it shears off or fractures, is moving too far rearward and getting into either the occupant zone and or the battery, both of which are concerning. So to me, that's kind of I would say a Band-Aid, but it is quick and dirty, relatively simple fix to modify your impact event. And then in the front, that leading edge I was talking about, to me that suggests that they're probably trying to get this whole drive module to ride up that ramp to enable some free crush space, extend the amount of time within the event that you're absorbing energy versus realizing a stack up where all the hard points, right, all the hard things are hitting one another, so that energy is then being transferred to the cabin. We don't like to see that.
And that also could be what these are for as well. It might just be time, a little bit of extra time in the impact script. So it could be intrusion, it could also be time as they're essentially looking through that impact pulse and trying to tune where they want all the energy to be as it's dispersed in the impact.
Absolutely, yeah. The other thing that we noticed almost immediately upon taking the shields down is this area on the underside of the motor and gearbox housing. So you see two machined ports here, some cast in formation, and then a bunch of machining and threaded holes here. When we had torn down the 2017 Bolt, they had a coolant path here, right? So this was additional thermal mass essentially via coolant and a galley here to help cool the motor and all the components inside. They don't have that anymore. So this is quite literally left blank. Now, I would want to look at all the different Bolt variations and or the other BEV applications that this motor may or may not be used on, because it's very likely that in another application they still need that additional coolant capacity. However, if you know that it's going on a Bolt, right? Why would you machine all of this, drill and tap it, leave all of that machining in there? Casting it in doesn't cost you anything. It's already in the tool. But if you're not using it, leave it as cast, and you can save, I don't know, 40 cents to $1 probably in terms of all of that machining, drilling, and tapping. So it is interesting that they got rid of it, number one, but moreover that they left all of the machining in place. To me, I would leave that as cast. But in terms of optimization, I'm relatively happy with some of the things that I'm seeing on the Bolt. As Sandy mentioned, from a cost perspective, a cost optimization perspective, they're going McPherson strut in the front, twist beam in the rear. So both of those are arguably some of the least expensive suspension options that you could choose. And then selectively, they're choosing a little bit more premium materials like this forged aluminum lower control arm. Looks like probably a forged aluminum knuckle, where they need probably to get some unsprung mass out and corrosion and so on and so forth.
So Jordan, this is not the first time we've seen the machining in the control arms.
No.
So, and obviously we talked about the machining operations here, and as a contrarian point of view, I'd point out, like, you don't want to maybe have two separate part numbers or manage something differently. So it might be cheaper for them just to, machine everything, and wherever it goes down the line, it goes. But this is interesting because it seems very purposeful, and I would say in the same vein of this particular motor, these control arms might end up on like the EUV, a slightly heavier vehicle, or maybe these are slightly revised, and essentially on various vehicles, they may be essentially making machine passes to make them as optimized as possible, or maybe because timing is kind of everything, they ran out of some time for some other optimization and found it later, didn't want to modify tools, and they're cutting them. I think it's more of the long line is it's being tuned for the vehicle specific, whether they want a control them to fracture in a particular way or just get mass out for the overall kind of size and scale of the vehicle. But this is not the first time we've seen this, and what was the other vehicle we saw?
The Rivian.
Was it the Rivian that also has done this? Granted, there's a completely different price scale involved with and complexity involved with the Rivian, but
the Rivian, I guess, it's still surprising that someone would do this in some regard, because it's quite literally just additional cost versus leaving something like this as forged or as cast and forged, depending on how the component's made. But the Rivian made more sense to me in that it is lower volume, it is a dramatically higher cost and more premium option of a vehicle, and so to see it on a low cost, higher volume BEV application from a company that's established like GM, I would imagine that either what Kevin was alluding to, that it's used on multiple applications, or that in a future iteration, right, if they truly believe they don't need the material and mass in those areas, in a future iteration, whether it be the forging tool that wears out or what have you, they would make that as forged to eliminate that machining operation.
And save the material.
Yep, absolutely. And in terms of the other optimizations and things that I like about what the Bolt did, although there's debate in terms of NVH performance, so noise, vibration, harshness, is the EAC compressor being mounted directly to the drive module. So in most BEV applications, or I'll say more premium BEV applications that are rear-wheel drive bias, you will see that the compressors are mounted independently of the drivetrain, right? So they'll typically have their own dedicated bracket. The bracket has isolators, so the compressor can be very specifically tuned to its frequencies and its modes based on its isolators. Whereas here, they're relying on the isolation of the compressor to be managed by the isolators of the overall drive module. So there's pros and cons to that. The cost optimization pro to me is there's no separate bracket and there's no separate and dedicated isolators for the compressor. It's a relatively sleek design.
And very inexpensive.
And very
which is,
inexpensive.
I think, a key attribute of this vehicle in general. And I think this one is stickered at, what, 35,000, I believe?
Correct.
So it is a true $35,000 MSRP EV, and even right now, the way this one is equipped, I think GM is offering some pretty aggressive incentives. Tempting enough for some people here. I don't think I can fit in this, but with gas prices the way they are, it's maybe worth a look again. So
Yeah.
I guess we've kind of covered most of the things we wanted to discuss here as we move rearward. If Corey was here, I think probably one of the first things he would hone in on is this, the heater here, and with respect to the overall plane of the vehicle if it were to essentially run over something. So the heater does hang a little bit low. It is tucked up behind the cradle itself, but it is relatively exposed, as is some of the connections here at the forepart of the battery pack itself. It's not terrible. It does have an aero shield, but it is an aero shield. Looks like it's kind of like a recycled material. It is not robust. It's not a skid plate or anything like that.
Yeah, it does seem different. This whole protection of high voltage components, connections, cables, all of those things seem to vary quite a bit depending on the OEM. I can tell you that even this, for example, right, on the EAC compressor, if you look from kind of where I'm standing, Josh, like the orange that you see, all this stuff on the leading edge, a lot of OEMs make a very concerted effort to place shields, sometimes stamped steel, sometimes cast aluminum. We've seen a lot of different strategies to protect that cabling so that in the event of a collision, you're not severing that, shorting out, and causing a thermal event. I think as time goes on, how OEMs are going to protect those and shield those and manage those crash events will morph and mature just like anything else. But I can say, looking at the Bolt just at first glance, although there's an aero shield here, they're being a little bit more aggressive in terms of what they're allowing to be exposed on the leading edge of some of these components. And more specifically like this, the primary connection to the battery is really in a pinch condition if you consider the movement of the subframe rearward towards the battery pack. So nothing too concerning, right? Clearly they've managed it. They've done the impact scripts, right? As we're seeing evidence of those little brackets up here, the whole SORB script and so forth. Mm-hmm. But I think more just a point of interest. Yeah.
And one thing that's interesting, even with the Cradle, you have these steel sleeved bushing cans. Obviously steel is cheap, and sometimes it's the right material. We were kind of discussing it earlier of whether or not it makes more sense to try and get that into casting. I think with essentially probably the service life of the actual component itself, the pressed in and the kind of overmolded bushing, that it probably doesn't, and the steel is suitable, cheap, and probably the right material in this particular place of the vehicle itself. So.
Yeah, and speaking of steel, I think it was, and Kevin, you and I had been working on a similar project in the time frame, the Alpha platform for GM, right?
Yes.
So we were doing studies on the Camaro, the ATS, and the CTS when they had first launched, and more so than on any other vehicle that came from GM prior to that, scalloping. GM took a very aggressive approach to the scalloping. So all in this torque box area, right? You see how it's sort of like crowning, or all of this. We would call it scalloping. This is a method to take weight out of the vehicle. It does not take cost out of the vehicle, because the blank or the steel before it is stamped into this form always goes to the outer bounds of this, and typically even a little bit further.
Yep. Further. Yeah.
So it actually doesn't save you any cost per se, but it does save weight. And GM, I can say more so than just about any other OEM out there as of late, has really been aggressive with their scalloping, which if you looked at the scale numbers from the Alpha platform vehicles, they came in as pretty light relative to some of their competitors. So
yeah,
it's pretty impressive. Good to see that they're carrying some of those things through to the Bolt.
Yeah, and this, as far as a platform, so I believe this started, probably development on this started as the Gamma, so the Sonic and some of the other smaller GM vehicles, but now it is like BEV2. And then the EUV is a derivative of BEV2 as well. So this eventually started as a nice platform and then migrated to essentially a dedicated EV platform as they essentially started to understand more about the packaging requirements and what they really wanted this vehicle to do, and probably to get it in line with their cost targets and things of that nature.
Right.
So it is, I guess, the front runner for their smaller electric vehicles itself.
When you look at it's interesting that you mentioned that. It just makes me think, looking at the battery pack here, talking about morphing from an existing ICE architecture or even a PHEV, right, which innately is driven off of an ICE architecture, generally speaking. The battery pack structures on these ICE derivatives, PHEVs, what have you, I see almost across the board in the past 5 years or so, a structure lattice system very, very similar to this. You look at the Mitsubishi Outlander PHEV, you look at the original MQB, the VW MQB platform, so the e-Golf, the Audi, the electric Audi A3, essentially. All those vehicles, and now the Bolt and the Volt before it, and all of these vehicles that are sort of doing this ICE derivative have a very similar system in that they're doing stamped steel weldments. They're replacing the cross car structure that they may be losing by nature of packaging for a battery pack, hard mounting at the sills, and they typically stay pretty far inboard from all the applications that I've seen, right? So if you look at a Tesla, an e-tron, an I-Pace, even some of the trucks that are coming to market, a Rivian, a Lightning, any of these vehicles, the battery pack, the outward bounds of the battery pack are coming closer and closer to the sill. Why? Because you want more battery packs so you can have more range, so you want a larger pack. But these ICE derivatives typically stay further inboard, whether that be because they had existing or legacy longitudinal body members that they weren't really willing to compromise on, right? They wanted to maintain that structure. It's past all of their torsional and rigidity requirements or what have you. We do see these packs consistently be further inboard when it's a adaptation or a derivative versus a BEV from the ground up.
Yeah, and Jordan, you were talking about it when we were looking at this yesterday. These stamp features here, you think are to help mitigate with side impact. And I think what's kind of interesting is we saw this on the newer GM like mid-size SUVs as well, the Acadia, the Terrain, where they do something similar to this, even for the fuel tank, where you might be seeing essentially the migration of some of these just requirements, like fuel systems, whether it is electrolyte or actually gasoline, to protect and whether it be like a kind of a beaching consideration to help with driving over something or to protect inside impact. When I see this being so segmented and separated, I'm thinking more side impact. When we looked at the Acadia, because of the fuel cell or fuel tank was so long and biased to one side of the vehicle, they essentially had a structure like this running down the entire side of it. Makes me again think more side impact, less ground clearance issues or protecting for
and especially I totally agree with what you're saying, especially when you look at where they are fore aft in the vehicle. Everywhere that they put one of these face plates, right, or these load absorption plates, is generally within the side impact zone, whereas if you move rearward, this rearward cross member on the battery pack, they didn't put one there because it's actually outside of the side pole zone. And so although these plates may not look like much, what they're going to do for the impact event is help distribute some of that side impact load, not only across this longitudinal rail here, but it's going to help manage some of the, I'll just call it sharpness for lack of a better term, on the outboard side of these cross members on the battery pack, right? So it's going to distribute that load. You're going to get a more even and controlled deformation of the vehicle as the barrier moves inboard. Okay.
Yeah, I think we're pretty much good to move rearward, yeah.
Right away, as we had mentioned when we were talking about cost optimization and low, inexpensive options that the Bolt deployed, the twist beam here, right? So this is one of the it acts as the cradle, it acts as the shock and the spring carrier, and it gives you a trailing arm effect. Really inexpensive, very simple. However,
Huge packaging space claim.
huge packaging space claim, right? So if you notice, the battery pack got, I would say, as close as they possibly could within a dynamic envelope, meaning a static thing next to a thing that moves, right? The trailing arm. But that's one of the trade-offs, right? If you want to have a low cost suspension system like a twist beam, you do absolutely compromise some of the battery packaging space. Whereas if they had a cradle or a K-frame, something more like, I'll say, the VW MQB, the e-Golf, and the A3 and the Passat and some of these vehicles, you would see that they use a twist blade. So what they do is eliminate this cross member, replace it with a K-frame that can wrap around further rearward in vehicle, attached to longitudinal rails, and because of that, they have more packaging space available for a battery pack. And granted, those vehicles also have a K-frame because on their ICE brothers and sisters, they've got a fuel tank.
Yep.
Right.
And it does cause some packaging constraints in this area because the beam does run significantly farther forward. And some of the vehicles we've looked at do cheat a little bit on some of the width of the battery pack, but depending on the nature of the vehicle and where it is in development, I think you can essentially engineer that out to give you a nice rectangular packaging space for the battery. But you can see here, and this is the worst condition at full droop, you know, I mean, my finger is touching here. You wouldn't see this while driving unless you got the vehicle off the pavement and into the air, which might be fun. But it's still very tight. It's probably in its like nominal position as it comes off this flange, somewhere in the realm of, I don't know, like 35 to 45 millimeters off the pack. And then here it's probably within 15, maybe 15 to, yeah, probably 15 in here. And then it probably is scooching down to like roughly 10 there towards the end of the flange where the twist beam turns out. One thing I think is interesting looking at the body back here, well, one, you have this big well for the spare. Could have been if it was a little bit larger, but when we were talking about the scalloping, is it's not as prevalent in the rear of this vehicle. And I wonder if that has to do maybe with trying to balance some weight considerations.
Yeah, it very well could be. I mean, there's no doubt when you look at this vehicle, the majority of the heavy things are on the front end of the vehicle. You've got your drive module, almost all your high voltage modules, front suspension, hood, occupant, right? Everything is sort of forward bias in this car. And so, yeah, it very well may be, Kevin, that they just said, you know what, we're not going to even scale it back here because we want the weight back there just for dynamics and load distribution.
And we've been told that the scalloping helps with, and the castleization, which you can see right through here. So this helps sometimes with panel nesting, but also breathability of the body in white once it gets wet in some of these areas. It helps shed water and help dry everything out and keep contaminants from building up and having corrosion issues. It might seem a little counterintuitive, but it helps keep things dry.
Sure.
There was something else, but now it's fleeting my mind. So,
sure. Well, I think we're at probably a pretty good point to wrap this one up. Covered front to rear. So all in all, I think it's honestly a pretty good option for a lot of people who maybe a little bit more on a budget. They're looking for something more economical, get you A to B, decent range. I'm pretty impressed with it, actually.
Yeah, and like I said, like a few of us have been looking at it here very, very recently because of the incentives they're offering. I don't know if you can even order one right now or what the state is because pretty much everyone is sold out with EVs kind of across the range. But it is a very cheap offering in the space, and there is some. I wouldn't consider it necessarily to be an overly cheap vehicle. We have looked at some vehicles that are extremely frugal and how they've been executed.
Sure.
Probably could never come to this country based off, crash and some other quality, concerns.
Regulatory.
Based off, the NAFTA market or the North American market for automobiles it's a tough market to be in from an emission standpoint, safety, and I think overall customer expectation, warranty claims, all that stuff. It's a tough market to be in. So it seems to be a pretty good offering itself.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I guess that's all for the Bolt Hoist review. So For all those watching, please keep in mind when we tear these vehicles down, we do so that we can generate reports, and ultimately it helps fund the channel. It helps obviously fund everyone that works on these and brings this content forward. So right now I'm actually leading the Model Y teardown. That report's going to be extremely exciting. It's a little bit different than our typical reports. We're doing side by side between the old Model Y, the new Model Y. So when we talk about the evolution of a Model Y, we really are highlighting not just the what has changed between the old and the new, but the how, and furthermore we're quantifying it and saying here's what Tesla's actually saving or paying to add or remove features, change materials, change bill of process, right? How they build up the car. So that's going to be a really exciting one, and I know everyone's super psyched about the 4680 pack. So if you are interested in the report, if you're working for a company, it is a relatively budget-friendly report, and I think there's going to be some good content in it. So if you are interested, please contact sales@leandesign.com. We'd love to help you out. So if you would, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, and we'll see you guys next time.
Thanks.
Thank you.